Hey, everybody, welcome to the Michael Steele podcast. I'm Michael Steele, and I'm looking forward to this conversation as we begin Black History Month. Woohoo! We get to talk about Black history, but a whole lot of people out there don't want us to do that. As my guest is the incredible Dr. Jason Johnson, Associate Professor of Politics and Journalism at the Morgan State University here in the great state of Maryland. And he's also an MSNBC political analyst. And he hosts his own podcast, which is really, really good listening. It's called A Word with Jason Johnson. We're going to get into a number of things, certainly what Black history has come to mean, and particularly given the fight that so many are putting up against the teaching of Black history, but also how we take in the events surrounding the death, the murder of Tyre Nichols, and that impact on the community. So sit back, relax as we kick off Black History Month with Dr. Jason Johnson right here on the Michael Steele podcast right after this. Well, everybody, I'm glad you could join us as we kick off Black History Month, and we start the conversation yet again about Black history with an intense sense of purpose that's going to probably piss some white folks off, because they seem to get upset, Jason, when we have this conversation. My guest is Dr. Jason Johnson. Welcome, bro, to the podcast. Welcome back, man. It's been a while.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting. You know, it's like we've had these weird Black History Months for the last couple of years. You remember the Black History Month that started, was it 4 years ago, with Governor Northam and whiteface and blackface? And it was just like, and you remember that was like February, if it was like that Friday or Saturday, it's like, what kind of Black History Month is this? I feel the same way. This stuff with DeSantis and the AP and everything else like that, I'm like, damn it, can't we just start a Black History Month with, like, I don't know, Serena winning another championship, or you know, some 14-year-old Black scientist developing a cure for Alzheimer's.
The interesting thing about, the interesting thing about, Black History Month and the chance that, we get to, I think, appreciate the incredible work of George Santos as the founder of Black History Month. and I just think,
Michael, that is misinformation. You know that George Santos is the person who invented the kufi hat. Okay,
that's right.
Black History Month. He invented the kufi.
Oh, that's right.
He was one of the original DJs with the Cold Crush crew in 1978. So he is a founder of hip hop and kufi style. I can't believe you were fooled by that.
I did, man.
That disinformation, man.
That's what I get for reading the wrong history. That's right. That's what I get. So let's start with the sublime before we get to the ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And the sublime for me is this whole narrative around Santos. His decision, I put in air quotes, to step down from his committee assignments. Why is he even a thing? Why are we as a country tolerating this bullshit of incompetence, lies? Is it just because the Republican Party won't let go of it, or what is going on that this now seemingly is the standard by which we're willing to go, okay?
Well, there's the macro down to the micro of this, right? You've heard me say this before. The macro is there is no Republican Party anymore. It's a dime store front for a terrorist organization. They abdicated any semblance of being a legitimate governing coalition in this country, not on January 6th. They abdicated that in the 2020 election when they didn't have a platform other than pledging loyalty to Trump. At that point, you're no longer a party, right?
Right.
So when you start trickling down from that, and then you get the gerrymandered districts, and then you get the sort of closed off Republican right-wing ecosystem, really not just Fox, but increasingly online, TikToks, particular Twitter handles and YouTube pages, you have a group of voters who are no longer interested in actual policy deliverables from their elected officials. They simply want people to exist as an antagonist or a cudgel that they can, swing against the people that they don't like. But the tacit assumption in that is that somebody's actually going to do the real government work too. They just don't care about it, right? So you take that to the specific district that Santos is in, and what you see is a situation where Democrats throughout the state of New York really didn't plan very well. Their redistricting went bad. That's how that state ends up with 5 Republicans. If the Democrats had handled New York better, they wouldn't have lost the House in 2022. Right. But then you have a Democratic Party in that particular district who didn't do even the most basic opposition.
No, that's the part that kills me.
I mean, like Michael, I was doing oppo research in college, right? Working for local Republicans. I worked for some local Democrats, but really basic oppo research. And the internet wasn't what the internet is today, right?
Look, I was doing oppo research when there was no internet. And trust me, we could get some dirt, man. We could find some stuff out.
Dumpster diving, libraries, just calling people, right?
Yes.
So the idea that so much of his publicly stated resume, we're not just talking about stuff on websites, but there's so much of his publicly stated resume was completely untrue, and that it was easily verifiable that it wasn't true, and that nobody locally chose to dig up this information throughout the entire course of the campaign is actually an indictment of the local Democratic Party. Right. I don't have any faith in the Republican organization anymore, but the fact that the local Democrats couldn't just look this up, I'm like, come on, people. So that's what you have. And, and recalling members of Congress is damn near impossible. The federal one.
It really is not constitutionally allowed. So it makes it very hard to do. So there is the sort of that just kind of moment with the George Santos narrative, the emergence of the hard right now controlling de facto not just the Republican Party, but the Republican House. And it sort of captured, I guess is a good way to put it, captured being known as Speaker McCarthy, who seems willing to give all to be largely an ineffectual leader. You have that as a backdrop, and then you kind of move beyond the Congress and you look more broadly out across the states. And you mentioned DeSantis, what's going on in places like Florida with, this attitude about, I put it this way, all of this noise around CRT and AP Black history is how they think and feel about us, about Black people, because you could make the same kind of allegations about how Western civilization is taught, how European history is taught. And yet there aren't people screaming about that. There aren't people screaming about the colonization of people, the enslavement of people writ large. I mean, take the African piece out. We can go to India. We can go, China.
You can go to the Philippines. You can go to China. You can go to all sorts of places. Yes. Yes.
So what is the expected benefit for Ron DeSantis beyond the obvious? Hey, I want to run for president because I'm a better form of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
What do you make of all of that?
What DeSantis is doing and what he's trying to sell to national donors and right-wing movements across the world, because again, it's a terrorist organization and not a party anymore. So this is connected to right-wing movements in Turkey. This is connected to right-wing movements in Russia, right-wing movements in Italy, is that using the existing system and the weakness of enforcement in our existing system, I can flood the lane with 50 million pieces of legislation, making it impossible for the majority forces or the majority sentiment in my state to either organize or combat all of these things at once. There's a reason I put it that way. If you look at it, most people are thinking of DeSantis and the Stop Woke Act, okay,
Right.
which is already being sued. There's injunctions against it. But see, it doesn't matter because the mere existence of that law has made so many different people concerned that you already have people saying, well, okay, I guess I can't teach about, the enslavement of people that even existed in the state. And I can't teach about the Trail of Tears. I did an interview on my podcast, A Word on Slate, with Professor Jonathan Cox. And this is a guy who's a professor. There was a big article about him in ProPublica. We talked about that. He's a sociology professor at University of Central Florida. And he made news because he canceled 2 of his classes this upcoming spring because he's like, look, I teach CRT. Now, I'm a college professor. These are elective classes. But given how vaguely and poorly these laws are written, the current status of the Stop Woke Act in Florida means that if you were perceived to be teaching anything that is remotely associated with critical race theory, it doesn't take a student, it doesn't take a dean or an administrator. Somebody in another state can look up your syllabus on a website, and if they think you're teaching critical race theory, they can report you to the State Board of Education. You can be investigated, and they will pull funding from your university. That's what you've got going on there.
Why so? So I would have said to that professor, then why not stress test that system? Hold the classes, right, and hold these sons of bitches accountable for the laws that they've enacted and the crap that they're putting out there about what this is and what it isn't. And so and have that fight. I mean, I get it. It's his career. It's all of that. But have that. You got to have that fight at some point, don't you? You do, and there are people suing. But here's the other part about it that I can speak, and I am a very blessed and fortunate faculty member in the School of Global Journalism and Communications, with Michael Steele has visited Morgan State University. Yep. It's also reflective of the fact these are never short-term. These are never short-term battles. This is also reflective of the fact that in 1980, your average university department, 80% of the faculty were tenured. Here we are in 2023, just a little under 40 years later, and only about 20% of most university departments are tenured. So you don't have people in positions to stand and fight the way they used to because of the battles against university tenure over the last 15 to 20 years. Mm-hmm. If I'm a tenured faculty member at a state or a private institution, then I can make that fight because you can't fire me. Right. But if you are the way most faculty are now, where you're on a contract, you can't do anything. The next thing, which DeSantis just rolled out, just announced, he's claiming that he's going to be increasing the salaries of teachers across the state, but it's really wrapped up in a union busting bill that now says that all state unions, of course, that's not going to include police unions, but teachers unions now have to turn their finances over to the state, and that you can't have the automatic collection of dues, and that you have to have, over 60% of the teachers at every single individual school before you can go represent them. It's all an attack on education as a whole. Critical race theory is just the way you get white folks excited, but it's an overall attack on education because when people are not educated, they can easily be swayed by whoever has the loudest megaphone, and elected officials always have the loudest megaphone. Right. That's what this is about. And critical race theory, since it ain't being taught, but the discussion itself, yes, you're right, Michael. It's about how white folks feel about us. Okay, a certain segment of white folks feel about us, but it's also what they feel about their own children, because what they're saying is, I don't want my son or daughter to challenge how I have been living as a public citizen, because that's what people are really afraid of. So they're afraid of their kids coming home and saying, "Mom and Dad, what'd you do?" Yeah, well, and to that point, I'm glad you walked into that way, because I literally yesterday had this conversation with a friend And I just stopped in the middle of our conversation because we were talking about white reaction to the Black people. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about Tyre Nichols in that episode and how some white folks are trying to redirect the conversation on that. Mm-hmm. But I was laughing at this notion that, white people, going after CRT, going after AP, African American history, downplaying, Black culture and achievement. And I said, well, all they have to do is go up to their daughter's bedroom and look on her wall and see the Black artists that she has penned photos of. Pull out her music collection and listen to the music she's listening to, the clothes she's wearing, the behavior she's imitating, the language she's imitating. I said, your white daughter is as Black, if not more Black than some Black girls, right?
I would push back on that, but I understand your point.
No, but I'm saying, but in terms of how they try to, project, and and I'm saying it in a very
tongue-in-cheeky way,
right, in a very cheeky and an endearing way. I'm not criticizing. I think it's great, and yet these parents have this reaction to Black culture and history in a way that they somehow think that their kids aren't going to learn that history or experience that culture. And that's just not the way it's going to play. So you make the right point that they're getting this information, they're exposed to this information. And their concern as parents, as white parents, is I don't want to have my child confront me about grandpa.
Right.
Or about this family's role in history or whatever.
Oh, it's deeper than that. And that's why this Florida thing, given what a huge and diverse state it is so strange. It ain't just what you were suggesting of, I don't want to have to talk about grandpa. It's also, I don't want to have to talk about grandpa's roommate, Bill. Okay. Who's been his roommate that comes for Thanksgiving and Christmas for the last 15 years. They're not just roommates, Stanley, okay, Turner, Hunter, okay. That's grandpa's boyfriend. They met playing pinochle 10 years after grandma died. We didn't know, right? Like that's really what some of this is about. It's about a loud, powerful minority screaming about the fact that they don't want their children to be aware of a world that they have actually been navigating, right? There's a story, you can look this up, it's a story out of Ohio. It's like 5 months ago. And so they had all these local elementary schools, and they had it was like a weekly reader thing, right? And they picked like the teacher of the county. So they go get this teacher. And NPR actually has the audio of this because NPR was covering these great teachers. Third grade teacher, wonderful. She starts reading The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss. Those of you who don't know, the whole thing about you had the different Sneetches. Some had stars upon their stomach, stars on theirs. Some
That's right, yeah.
And then this guy comes in, and since the ones with stars were mistreating the ones without stars, he starts selling fake stars, right? And it becomes this whole interesting conflict. I watched it as a cartoon as a kid. So anyway, the audio has the teacher reading the Sneetches story to third graders. Great. We all love Dr. Seuss, right? And then one of the third graders on his own says, oh, that's like how white people used to treat Black people. Third grader. And the school representative, the school comms person is like, shut this down. Shut down a weekly reader, best teacher in the school read through on NPR because a white third grader was able to figure out what the hell the lesson of the Sneetches was anyway.
Right.
It's also a lesson about capitalism. So that's the epitome of what Ron DeSantis is trying to avoid. And I'm not saying that third grader is going to go out and march and scream Black Lives Matter and trans rights. What I'm saying is that third grader is at least aware of history.
Well,
and that third grader understands that the way he deals with his Black friends today may be different than how it was when his parents were younger.
That's it. And it's because the way that white third grader is exposed to communities of people, regardless of attempts to limit that exposure.
Right.
That goes back to what I was just saying. It doesn't matter if he's living in an isolated all-white community, if he's on the internet, if he's in a chat room, if he is talking with friends who happen to have Black friends, you're going to get that exposure one way or the other. And it is that exposure which seems to me to be the most damning aspect of this, that folks just do not want the exposure to happen, but it does, it has. And the reason it has, and it will, and it does, is it precisely because of the work that was defined, the definitive work of Nicole Hannah Jones in the 1619 Project. You cannot unsee, unhear, unlive, unexperience something that has been ingrained into our culture and the fabric of this country since 1619.
You would think, and yet, Michael, in that same state, the now red state, because that story, the NPR story, I think it's out of Columbus or Cincinnati, it was in the southern part of the state. There's another story, I think it was New York Times a day or two ago, it was on Vice. Right. It was a Vice article I read, it came out yesterday, about a network of homeschooling neo-Nazis in Sandusky, Ohio, where Cedar Rapids is, a big amusement park. I mean, I used to live up there. And what's interesting to me is that it literally, they have a homeschool curriculum from neo-Nazis. Thousands of people are part of this homeschooling curriculum in Northern Ohio, okay? You don't have anybody complaining about that.
No,
that
of course
you got
not.
actual Nazis who want to overthrow this government, being trained, but you're mad because Timmy might learn about the Trail of Tears.
It's all white because it's all right. So,
I mean, basically.
Yeah. So that's again, sort of, I always have my criticisms about Black History Month for a lot of reasons, but I think now in this environment, you really begin to appreciate more so why it's an important story to tell, because if nothing else, it forces the conversation. Ron DeSantis spews out his bullshit in front of white audiences. He's not taking his ass in front of Black people in Florida and talking to them.
No.
And that tells me a lot. So, Mr. DeSantis, if and when you decide to run for president, I'm willing to hold that first town hall meeting with Black folks here in Maryland. All right? Prince George's County, Charles County, Baltimore City, wherever you want to go, you come and then you tell us why, as president, you think your policies of Florida are good for us. You ain't ready to have that conversation, babe, because you can't. Because you can't.
That's also why he can't win. I mean, exactly. Michael, you've heard me say this before, and I know you do, but I have more friends who have nothing to do with this world, right?
Right.
I've got a lot of friends who they have nothing to do with politics, so they're the ones who ask me questions. They're like, "What's with this? And who's going to run?"
Right.
I was like, I don't make 2024 estimates. There's too much going on. I said, but I can tell you this. I can tell you some shit that won't work. And what won't work, I said, is it's almost like people forget what Florida's reputation is. Okay.
Yes.
It is considered this wild, crazy backwater. It is the right-wing version of what Midwesterners think of California. You can't make America look like the rest of Florida. And that's going to stick with him once he tries to make himself a national character. He also lacks the charisma and the humor of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a funny guy. I may not like him, but he has wit and he is fast and he is humorous in a certain way. Ron DeSantis is a humorless joke. And then lastly, and you've heard me say this, I always sort of lay this out when I had the opportunity to explain. There's a difference between being electable and being viable.
Yes.
Being viable is you can win your party's nomination. Being electable is you can win a general election. These are two very different skill sets.
Very much.
I developed this back when I was in grad school. John Kerry was an incredibly viable guy, but he was never going to be electable.
Right.
I was like, that guy could never, but he was perfect to win a party's nomination. Rand Paul back then was never viable, but Rand Paul could have won a general election about 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
If he had been able to get through the crazy primary, he could definitely have gotten himself elected president of the United States. So what you have now is a situation where, is Ron DeSantis even viable? I don't know that he can win his party's nomination. Maybe if Trump runs as an independent, but is he electable? He's definitely not electable.
No.
I don't think he can beat even a weakened Joe Biden. He can't.
I agree with that analysis, and you're spot on with electability versus viability. It is something that, us chairmen hone in on when we're looking at and assessing candidates for office. And there's one other thing that DeSantis has that Donald Trump does not have, and that's a glass jaw. Donald Trump can take a punch.
Yeah.
Ron DeSantis can't. I've watched his debate with Charlie Crist. Mm-hmm. And if that got you all upset and riled up and scared and looking like a deer stuck in the headlights, dude, what are you going to do on a national stage with every freak, not just you national Klieg lights on you, but global Klieg lights on you? What are you going to do? So I think there's a lot of this sort of, I feel better falling onto Ron DeSantis inside the GOP without answering the question you just posed. Is he viable or is he electable? And when you have a candidate who is a question mark with one and a no with the other, why are you even dancing with that person?
I mean, and here's the thing. I honestly think that 2024 Joe Biden, there might only be one or two Republicans he could beat, but they happen to be Trump and DeSantis. I mean, I think almost any other Republican you could run, I have said by 2024, they're damn near going to be Weekend at Bernie's with that guy, right? But I'll tell you this, I could share this, and this, all the Democrats, I don't care what the president has said, all the Democrats have a plan B if he doesn't run or if he's incapable of running. They all do, and there's a part of me that almost wonders, he's not going to step down. None of those things will happen. There is no precedent in history. There's no precedent, forget president in history of white men at that age with that level of power stepping down voluntarily. That never happens. So he's not leaving. He's going to run again. He would never, ever do that. But I do say sincerely that if for some reason he was not going to run again, or worse, he was incapable of performing the duties of the president, say sometime this year, the absolute scrum and the Democratic Party for that job, because Vice President Harris has not cleared the field.
No, she's not going to clear the field.
No, none of those guys. He ain't cleared the field.
No, they're not afraid of her.
They're not at all. Not at all.
No.
There's a reason that President Biden doesn't send her to negotiate with McCarthy, even though she's a senator. It's because they don't want her. They want him. They're not even paying attention to her. And so, the scrum that would exist on the Democratic side, that might be an opening for a lot more Republicans. But the Democrats at this point, between Pennsylvania and Maryland, they kind of got a ticket. They could throw together a ticket fairly quickly.
My bet would be those two states are out of pocket, out of place, simply because no one's going to take a governor who's 6 months into the job and say, hey, let's make you president, when you've got someone like Whitmer who's been through the fire. Just saying. Just saying.
You have
but,
more faith in the American people than I do.
Well, that's not the American people. That's the Democratic Party. So that's a different horse.
Yes,
the American people would speak upon that. And I think to your first point, they would say, you know what, we'll take this tried and true Republican over here over this untested, unproven Democrat. It's just my take. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to continue our Black History Month conversation with my buddy and friend, Dr. Jason Johnson, right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the Michael Steele podcast. As we turn the corner here and we begin to settle down into the next 27 days, which make Black History Month, because the day is the first day, so that's 28. I want to turn our attention, before I let you scoot, my friend, to the tragic narrative story of Tyre Nichols, murdered by 5 Black police officers, and the stories that are starting to emerge here as we again grapple with Black history, talk about the modern day enforcement of law and order on the Black community, and how that really is not that much different from what emerged, in Reconstruction, with the creation of police departments for the purposes of curtailing African Americans' social behavior. What's your take on the Tyre Nichols case, and specifically the imagery of 5 Black police officers on the screen in connection with his murder?
So the first thing I'll say, you've heard me say this, Michael, for the audience to understand, I am a police abolitionist. I think we should end policing as it currently exists. It does not work. It does not work consistently. It does not work effectively. I say this across the board. The way that we conceive of policing, the way that we organize policing, the way that we fund policing does not lead to the results that we want. We have decades of evidence that spending more money on police does not reduce crime. We have the average police department in America only solves about 46% of homicides. Only about 46%. If your average high school was only graduating 46% of their students, we would shut it down. If your average hospital was only delivering 46% of the babies that were supposed to be born there, we would shut down the hospital. Why do we tolerate such consistent incompetence and dumping money into policing that doesn't give us the results that we want? So that being said, to go specifically into what you see in Memphis, it is a quintessential example of the micro problem, what I'm saying about how policing doesn't work. I used to love this show on FX called The Shield.
Oh,
Vic
yeah,
Mackey,
I remember that. Yes.
Love that show. One of the best shows in TV, one of the best endings. That and Homicide: Life on the Street are 2 of the best endings of any TV shows in history. And the idea of these strike teams, these hyper aggressive cowboy police officers.
In this case, the Scorpions, as they were noted.
In this case, the Scorpions. But think about it. They're called the Scorpions in Memphis. They called them the Red Dogs under this police chief when she was in Atlanta. In Pittsburgh, they call them the Jump Out Boys. These sound like gangs.
Yeah.
They're gang names. Red Dogs, Jump Out Boys, Scorpions? What do we get, the Sharks and the Jets and the Pink Ladies? What the hell?
It's true.
Right?
Yeah.
So when you've got police officers who have nomenclature that is indistinguishable from street gangs, and then you empower them with an unnecessary amount of weapons and no oversight, this is what you get writ large. And it's happening all over America. And it's happening to white people, and it's happening to Black people and more Black people. And we've seen that since George Floyd was murdered in 2020, that violence, that the shooting of unarmed civilians has gone up in America, that the spending on police departments has gone up in America, and the crime problem hasn't been fixed. So that's where this comes from.
Right.
Now, the fact that these guys are all Black and Qs, 3 of them, I don't care. Because one thing that anybody should understand, Michael understands this, anybody out there, is that if there's one thing that American history has shown us, it's that when you put minorities in charge of white supremacist institutions, the person is way more likely to change than the institution.
It's true.
So I don't care how many Black cops you throw in. KRS-One told me about that 30 years ago. Black cop, Black cop, Black cop. Listen to the song, right? So
Well, and let's take it back, let's take it back into the days of slavery. There's a difference between the African American in the house and the African American in the field.
Yeah. So all those things I'm not shocked by this. I will say this though, and this is kind of odd. I interviewed Philip Atiba Goff on my podcast last week. Really, really smart guy. He's at Yale. He does the Center for Policing Equity. We had a great conversation on my podcast on Slate. And one of the things that he laid out, I had never heard of this before. I asked him, I was like, look, do demographics matter with police? Right? We always talk about, if we could diversify the cops, whatever. And he said they have one instance of this being the case. This shocked me. They have 3 years of data in the city of Chicago, and they looked at all demographics of police officers. They have enough Latino, African American, and white officers. What they found, when you control for time on the force, location, experience, everything else like that, Michael, guess which demographic of police officers was the least likely to use excessive force? Take a guess.
White police officers.
White women.
White women.
Shocked the hell out of me.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, now we don't know if it's transferable, but in the city of Chicago, they found that like by a measurable amount that white female police officers were the least likely to use excessive force against Black people. Who knew? Right?
Yeah.
So what it also speaks to is this idea that even when we want to say that diversifying officers is necessarily going to lead to different results, I mean, white female cops are still beating brothers to death. Right. They just happen to do so at a rate slightly less aggressive. Right. Yay.
I'll sleep better tonight knowing that.
Yes. I get pulled over by a Karen instead of a Keisha. Am I supposed to feel safer? I'm still got pulled over. So, but again, what it speaks to is this larger problem that we have about policing. And I'll also say this sort of quickly because, it is sad and it's tragic. I've talked to my students at Morgan State about this. When you look at this kind of behavior is never isolated. So that's why I don't even get that excited about these 5 guys being fired and going on trial, because it's like, that ain't the first time they did that. It's not. Yeah. They were too good at it. Right. There's 27 other people that saw this, right? There's 27 other people that have seen previous activities that they've engaged in. That's why I say you can't reform this. You have to tear this stuff up from the roots and build something new. We can't say that we can't do it. We've done it before in America. We used to have a Department of War, and then we got rid of the Department of War because we realized it wasn't effective. And people at the time were like, how are we going to live without the Department of War? We came up with something called the Department of Defense. And you know what? It seemed to work throughout the Cold War. We didn't get nuked, right? Yeah. So you can't tell me that this country lacks the creativity, the capacity, or the ingenuity to come up with something different than what we call policing today, because this stuff doesn't work.
Are we just at this point too heavily invested in the concept, the idea of policing, police force, Blue Lives Matter, the blue line? People have this sort of knee-jerk reaction to any suggestions like you've made, that somehow you're now anti-police because you want to reform the system. How do you begin to overcome those hurdles, particularly when you have a feckless political leadership on both sides, too scared on one hand, too aggressive on the other, to actually begin to cleave out the kind of reform, as your example noted, between a Department of War and the Department of Defense, as an example, to move from sort of an antebellum police narrative formed for the explicit purpose of rough riding Black folks to something that is actually authentic, genuine policing to keep communities, regardless of color, safe?
Well, first you start with money. I mean, it does take political courage, but you start with money, and you start with numbers. Your average state, you got way the hell more teachers than you have cops. Right. And what your fear is losing the police unions. They ain't that many damn cops. OK, you've got a better bet of funding, making friends with, and using the organization of teachers unions or nurses unions or some other union to counter the police. So much of this is about political leadership being like, oh, my God, I don't want to piss off the police unions. It ain't that many. It ain't that many. There's other unions that you can make friends with. The other thing is you start passing laws to hold police departments as accountable as other agencies. You stop allowing them to run up the budget with these insurance programs that they get massive insurance coverage every time they make a mistake. I pointed this out 6 or 7 years ago with the city of Pittsburgh. On average, the city of Pittsburgh has like about 1,100 police officers, right? The taxpayers were paying an average of $1,000 a year per police officer in that city when you broke it down for all the penalties and settlements they were paying for police brutality. These police departments are having $8, $9, $10 million settlements
for
police brutality. What the hell are you doing? So I would go in politically. I would use my power to say, look, I'm going to empower the teachers unions because I'm going to need y'all's help. I'm going to empower you nurses unions. I'm going to need y'all's help. And then we're going to fight to pass some laws to rein in these police departments. We don't even have to cut your funding. We have to cut the opportunities that you have to keep yourselves from being held accountable. We will introduce licensure where you can take a cop's license so you can't just go from one place to the next. And we will then slowly but surely implement, kind of like what you have in St. Louis, completely different intervention programs for community problems so that you don't even freaking need the police. There are times where you need somebody with a gun. You know when you need that? In a hostage situation or a bank robbery. But 9 times out of 10, police show up after crimes have been committed. They don't need guns. They're just investigating. Half the time, police, when they end up pulling people over, this is what they did when they recognized in Minneapolis. Minneapolis had been pulling back from police funding long before what happened with George Floyd. And you know what they recognized? That the majority of their money was being spent, and the majority of their cases and instances and complaints about police brutality were about the police beating up homeless people. So how about we offer free heated tents on the streets, and they lowered their police instances of violence against citizens by 20%. There are ways to fix this stuff. And again, I'm not a reformer. I'm an abolitionist. But I just ran out 3 different things that you could do.
So if you abolish it, what do you replace it with?
You replace it with a public safety force.
And what do they do?
So they are much more targeted. Use the same micro-targeting that you use, the same micro-targeting you use in marketing. So you specifically categorize events and send off intervention forces based on events and concerns. A lot of time is wasted. A lot of money and resources are wasted by having police just randomly patrol. You know what cops do when they patrol. They're on the computer. They're talking on the phone. They're seeing their mistresses. The vast majority of times, they're not actually solving anything. And we pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for these police cars and these officers to just be riding around all day. Scale back on that. Get yourself intervention forces that have trained individuals. You have people with mental health problems. Why are you sending cops? We have orderlies in mental health institutions. Train orderlies on police intervention and send them. This person has a mental health problem. Those guys are big. They're strong. They can take people in. They know how to use non-lethal weapons. There, you took 3 mentally ill homeless people off the street, didn't have to shoot nobody, didn't have to pay a cop $400,000 a year to do it. You can have intervention forces. We have a domestic violence call. We're going to send an intervention force, 1 officer with a weapon, a negotiator, and a counselor. People are like, oh, hey, isn't that way more expensive? Actually, it isn't. Because if you look at the number of instances where domestic violence cases end up turning into violence, people get shot, then you have lawsuits against the department. Overall, it ends up being cheaper. If I can send somebody to the door and say, hey, I'm the interventionist. Let me talk you 2 down. Can I put you guys in separate places? If you do not listen to me, there's a guy in the car with a gun. I bet you can get those people to walk outside the house.
Yeah.
What happens when you send a police officer in full gear to a house when you make a domestic violence call? That woman gets killed. That man gets scared. That man gets angry. And I tell people this all the time, sort of closing this, when they think that they don't have any other options, that these violence things are necessary. You want to know how we can tell for sure that police violence is out of control and it's a matter of just how mismanaged it is and how we can do something different? All you have to do is look at military police. How often do we hear about military police killing people? Almost never.
Right.
Because they don't. And yet military police are encountering people who are trained killers. If you're a military police officer on a base, that means almost every house you go to, there's trained soldiers in there.
Right.
Yet
right.
somehow they manage to arrest people and bring them in all the time and no one dies. Why is that? Even though they know they're dealing with trained people often with weapons, because they inherently respect the humanity of the people who they're encountering. Because that military police officer goes to that house and sees those two people on the front porch fighting. It's like, they took the same oath as me. We're all soldiers. I'm gonna do everything I can to bring this person in because they fight the same wars I do.
Right.
It ain't a training issue. It's the culture issue. So you got to tear it up and build something new.
I'll give you the props on the culture piece. I want to have you back to talk a little bit more and to explore, because I find your analysis and conclusions really interesting to pursue. I'm not an abolitionist, but I am very much a reformer. And I've advocated, as you just indicated, along the same lines of building within our police department less need for police intervention and more need for cultural and societal intervention with health professionals, mental health professionals, people who deal in domestic violence. Make them an active part of this. They become the first responders.
Yes.
The police are the backup, as you noted, in case people just want to show their ass, like my mama would say. Then you have the law enforcement part when there's a breakdown in the domestic, cultural, etc. piece. So I'd love to have that conversation, because I think a lot of times people would hear what a Dr. Jason Johnson is saying and go, he's anti-police. He's not anti-police. He's pro-community. And there's a big difference. And it's how we can better integrate policing into the community in a way that is less militarized, less interventionist, more responsive based on the need in front of it. So if the need in front of it is a husband and a wife in a domestic violence situation, maybe the guy showing up with the gun who will likely incite a response, and we know of cases, is preeminent, that invariably going there to protect the woman is the one who gets her hands on the gun and shoots the cop. Right. Because you're messing with my man. So there are a whole lot of aspects of this I'd love to dig down with you, Jason, because it's a fascinating discussion, and I think it's part and parcel of what our conversation is going to be going forward. So thank you for raising it. And I want to again, thank you for coming on and helping us open up Black History Month. And giving due props, to its founder and cohort, George Santos. Like I said, we really appreciate that. Dr. Jason Johnson, he is my friend and colleague at MSNBC as a political analyst. He is also associate professor of politics and journalism at the Morgan State University. Thanks again, my friend. You can follow Jason on Twitter at Dr. Jason Johnson. And certainly check out his podcast, A Word with Jason Johnson, wherever you get your podcasts. You got to listen to the brother, because not only is he smart, but he's damn good at getting his guests to have that conversation. So,
thanks, man. Really appreciate it. Anytime. And like I said, happy to come back, because there'll be somebody else killed soon. So happy to come back and have that conversation.
And on that, I say good day.